The first thing you noticed was the smell. Acrid smoke, sharp and angry, clinging to the sagebrush. It was the kind of smell that told you something good had come to a bad end. Then, through the shimmering heat haze off the flats, you saw the source. A skeleton of a wagon, its canvas top gone, its ribs blackened like old bones picked clean by buzzards. The air was still, too still. Nothing moved but the lazy circling of a hawk high above, riding the thermals. Any man with sense would have spurred his horse and kept on riding. Trouble found folks easy enough out here without going looking for it. But Silas was not a man who listened to sense. He was a prospector, a loner, carved from the same hard rock and stubborn grit as the mountains he haunted. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the dry, cracked earth. He walked the perimeter of the disaster, his eyes missing nothing. The scorch marks on the ground, the splintered axle, the abandoned cookpot, its contents now a black crust. It looked like a raid, Apaches maybe, or bandits. But something was wrong. There were no bodies, no arrows, just a deep, profound silence that felt heavier than a tombstone. He stood there for a long time, a statue of a man against the endless sky, his face giving away nothing. Not shock, not pity, just a deep, listening stillness. And that's when he heard it. Faint at first, almost lost in the whisper of the wind. A thin, reedy wail. It was the sound of life where there should have been only death. He followed the sound to a patch of unburned scrub oak a few yards from the wreck. There, swaddled in a soot-stained blanket, lay a baby. Its face was red and pinched from crying, its tiny fists balled up in protest against the cruelty of the world. It lay beside the ruin, a tiny, impossible survivor. Silas stopped. He just stood there, staring down at the child. The baby's cries hitched, its wide, terrified eyes fixing on the tall, bearded stranger looming over it. Any other man might have knelt, cooed, offered some kind of comfort, but the prospector said nothing. He didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. He just watched, his expression as blank and unreadable as a weathered stone, as the baby cried and cried beside the burned wagon. A strange, unnerving tableau in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. For a full minute, he remained frozen. It was as if he were seeing a ghost, or maybe wrestling with one inside himself. The baby's cries were the only thing anchoring the moment to reality. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Silas crouched. Not to the baby. He reached past it, his calloused fingers brushing aside the blanket. There, clutched in the infant's tiny hand, was a small object. He gently pried the fingers open. It was a piece of wood, whittled into the shape of a bird. A wren, maybe. The carving was simple but elegant, the work of a patient hand. Silas stared at the wooden bird, turning it over and over. His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his beard. He slipped the bird into his leather vest pocket. Only then did he look at the baby again. He surveyed the wreckage one last time, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was looking for something, or someone, but the plains were empty. With a grunt that sounded more like pain than effort, he scooped up the swaddled child. It was impossibly light in his arms. The crying stopped almost instantly, replaced by a hiccuping sigh, as if the baby had exhausted its capacity for grief. He carried it back to his mule, a long-suffering beast named Clementine. He fashioned a makeshift sling from a spare blanket, securing the baby to his chest. It was an awkward, clumsy arrangement. He was a man used to handling pickaxes and dynamite, not something so fragile. The journey back to his camp was silent, save for the plodding of Clementine's hooves and the soft, sleeping breaths from the bundle on his chest. He didn't speak. He didn't hum. He just rode, his gaze fixed on the trail ahead, but his mind was clearly 1,000 miles away, lost in a place as desolate as the landscape around them. His camp was little more than a lean-to built against a rock outcropping, a fire pit, and a scattering of tools. It was the home of a man who owned nothing he couldn't carry. He laid the baby down on his own bedroll, a rough collection of burlap and animal pelts. He needed to feed it. But what did a baby eat? He had jerky, hardtack, and coffee. He ended up boiling a strip of jerky until it was soft, then mashing it into a thin, salty broth. He dipped his finger in the gruel and offered it to the baby. The child, driven by a primal hunger, latched on, sucking greedily. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The air grew cold. Silas built up the fire, the flames pushing back the encroaching darkness. He sat across from the baby, watching it sleep. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing lines of hardship and a deep, soul-crushing weariness that had nothing to do with a long day's ride. He had a survivor on his hands, a witness, a complication he could not afford. The sensible thing to do was ride to the nearest town, redemption, and hand the child over to the sheriff or the church. Find a family to take it in. Forget he ever saw that burned wagon. He should have walked away. He should have left the baby to its fate, the way the wilderness always demanded. It was the law of survival, but he hadn't. He had picked it up. He had brought it here, and now he was responsible. He lay down on the cold ground, his back to the fire, the bedroll given over to his tiny, unexpected guest. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The image of the burned wagon, the silence, and the little wooden bird were seared into his mind. He didn't know what to do. He was a man adrift, and this child was an anchor, pulling him down into waters he'd long since escaped. The night was long and cold. The baby woke twice, its sharp cries piercing the silence. Each time Silas rose without a word, tended to its needs with a rough, unfamiliar tenderness, and put it back to sleep. He moved like a man in a dream, his actions mechanical, his face a mask of stone. When the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern sky, Silas was already awake. He had been for hours. He stood by the fire, nursing a tin cup of black coffee, staring not at the sunrise but at the small, sleeping form on his bedroll. A decision had been made in the quiet, desperate hours of the night. He looked at his tools lying near the lean-to, a sturdy felling axe, a draw knife, his small, razor-sharp whittling knife. He looked at the pile of pine wood he'd gathered for fires. Then he looked back at the baby. He set down his coffee cup. He picked up the axe. He walked past the baby, past the tethered mule, to a small, level patch of ground near the rock wall of his shelter. He began to clear the space, kicking aside rocks and pulling up stubborn weeds. His movements were full of a strange, new purpose. He wasn't packing to leave for town. He wasn't prospecting for gold. He wasn't setting a trap or digging a grave. He raised the axe and swung, the clean thwack of steel on wood echoing in the morning stillness. He was breaking down a seasoned log, splitting it into manageable planks. He wasn't building a fire. He was building a cradle. The work consumed him. He became a machine of focused intent. He used the draw knife to smooth the rough-hewn planks, the shavings curling at his feet like fallen leaves. He measured with his eyes, judged angles with his hands. He was building it from memory, following a blueprint etched into his soul. Every notch, every joint was precise. He worked without pause, ignoring the growl in his stomach and the ache in his back. The baby, now awake, watched him from the bedroll, its eyes following his every move. The rhythmic sounds of his labor, the scraping of the knife, the soft tapping of a wooden mallet, seemed to soothe it. He used pieces of the wrecked wagon he'd salvaged, lengths of sturdy oak that had somehow survived the blaze. It felt right, to take something from that scene of destruction and shape it into a place of rest, a place of safety. It was a kind of prayer, offered up by a man who had forgotten how to pray. He worked all day. As the sun reached its zenith, he had the basic frame assembled. 2 curved rockers, 4 posts, and the slats for the small bed. It was simple, rustic, but it was sturdy. It was honest. He took a break only to feed the baby the same jerky broth as before. He held the child in one arm, his hands stained with sawdust and sweat. The baby looked up at him, its expression one of pure, trusting innocence. Silas looked away, his face grim. This act of creation felt like a penance, but he wasn't sure for what sin. By evening it was finished. He sanded the last rough edge with a piece of sandstone until it was smooth as river rock. He placed it on the level ground he'd cleared. He gave it a gentle push with his finger. It rocked back and forth with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Perfect. He gently lifted the baby from the bedroll and laid it inside the cradle. He pulled the soot-stained blanket over it. The baby blinked once, twice. Then its eyes drifted shut, lulled by the gentle motion. For the first time, Silas saw a flicker of something in his own eyes. Not joy, not pride, something quieter. A fragile sense of rightness in a world gone wrong. He had built a home for a child who had none, a temporary harbor in a storm. But the storm was still out there, and it was coming for him. He knew this because a shadow had fallen over his camp. He looked up, his hand instinctively going to the axe that lay beside him. A rider sat on a horse at the edge of the clearing, the setting sun at his back, turning him into a dark silhouette. "That's a mighty curious sight," the rider said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. "Smoke on the horizon for days, a burned-out wagon on the flats, and I find a prospector playing carpenter for a foundling." The man dismounted. He wore a dusty coat and a tin star pinned to his chest. Sheriff Wallace from Redemption. His eyes were hard and missed nothing. They took in the cradle, the baby, and the grim-faced man standing beside it. "Found it like that," Silas grunted, his voice rusty from disuse. "Wagon was still smoldering. Baby was all that was left." The sheriff walked closer, his gaze sweeping the camp. "Bandits, you figure?" "Probably." Wallace stopped at the cradle, looking down at the sleeping infant. "Funny thing for a man like you to build. Most folks would have just brought the child to town." His eyes lifted, pinning Silas with a sharp, questioning stare. "Why didn't you?" Silas didn't have an answer, or rather, he had one he couldn't give. He just shrugged, the gesture tense and defensive. "Got to it. Was planning on heading in tomorrow." The sheriff didn't look convinced. He walked over to the wreck of the wagon, which Silas had dragged closer for materials. "Funny thing about this raid," Wallace said, kicking at a charred piece of wood. "No bodies, no graves dug. You find any signs of the parents?" "Animals," Silas said, his voice flat. "Coyotes, vultures. They're quick." "They are," the sheriff agreed, his eyes narrowing. "But they're not clean. They leave things behind. Bones, scraps of cloth. I've seen a dozen raid sites in my time. This ain't one of them. This feels different." He turned back to Silas. "This feels personal." His gaze landed on a small table Silas had made from a stump. On it, beside a tin plate, lay the small carved wooden bird. The sheriff picked it up. "Where'd this come from?" "Was in the baby's hand," Silas said, his whole body tensing. He was giving away too much. Wallace turned the bird over in his palm. "The Miller family," he said softly. "They passed through Redemption a week ago. Fine woodcarver, the husband. Always left his mark. This little bird, it's his signature." He looked up, his eyes like chips of ice. They were good people. A man, his wife, and their new baby girl, heading west to meet his brother. "You sure you didn't see anyone else, old-timer?" Silas just shook his head, his face a stone mask. He was a bad liar, and he knew it. His silence was better than any clumsy excuse. The sheriff held his gaze for a long moment, the unspoken questions hanging heavy in the air. He knew Silas was holding something back. He just didn't know what. Finally, with a sigh, Wallace placed the bird back on the stump. "Well," he said, his tone changing, becoming official. "The circuit judge is due in Redemption in a few days. He'll want a report. I'll be back. Don't you go wandering off." It wasn't a request, it was an order. Silas watched him mount his horse and ride away, disappearing into the twilight. He was no longer alone in the wilderness. The world had found him. The law had found him. And soon, he feared, something far worse would too. He looked at the baby sleeping peacefully in the cradle. This small, fragile life had tangled him in a web he had spent years trying to escape. He ran a hand over his face, the weariness hitting him like a physical blow. His isolation was over. His peace was shattered. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that building the cradle was only the beginning. He had built a shelter, but now he had to defend it. The sheriff's visit had changed everything. The name, Miller, had landed like a stone in a quiet pond, the ripples spreading out to touch a past Silas had tried to bury. He knew the Miller family. Not well, but he knew them. He'd seen them in a town 2 states back, seeing the husband carving little birds just like the one in his pocket, his pregnant wife smiling beside him. He had been tracking them, not with malice, but with a kind of desperate hope. He had a message for them, a warning. But he'd been too late. The smoke on the horizon had told him that. Finding the baby was a cruel twist of fate. He had stared at her, not out of shock, but out of recognition and a profound, suffocating guilt. The silence was his confession. He should have been faster. He should have been braver. Now the sheriff thought he was a liar and maybe a killer, and the real killers were still out there. He looked down at the baby in the cradle. He couldn't keep calling her the baby. It felt disrespectful to her parents, to the memory of the Millers. He took the small wooden bird from his pocket. It was a wren. "Wren," he whispered. The name felt right. "Your name is Wren." The baby stirred, her mouth making a small, sucking motion in her sleep. For the first time, Silas felt a flicker of something other than guilt or fear, a fierce, protective instinct. He had failed her parents. He would not fail her. He knew he had to leave. The sheriff would be back, and his questions would become accusations. And if the law found him, they would find him too. The men he truly feared. The men who had left that wagon a smoldering ruin. He began to pack his meager belongings onto Clementine's back. Food, water skin, his tools, his bedroll, everything fit neatly, the practiced efficiency of a man long on the run. But then he looked at the cradle. It was too big, too heavy. He couldn't take it with him. He would have to leave it behind, an odd monument to a single day of strange, desperate carpentry. He walked over to it, resting a hand on the smooth, curved wood. Leaving it felt like an admission of defeat. It felt like abandoning the one good thing he had done in a very long time. He couldn't do it. With a sigh of resignation, he took out his tools again. He would dismantle it, carefully. He would number the pieces with charcoal so he could put it back together again. It was a foolish, sentimental act, a dangerous delay, but it was a promise he had to keep. He was carefully prying apart a joint when the hair on the back of his neck stood up. The same feeling a deer gets just before the wolf strikes. He froze, listening. It wasn't the sheriff. The lawman rode with a certain, steady, plodding rhythm. This was different. This was the near silent tread of a predator. He slowly straightened up, turning his head just enough to scan the ridge line above his camp. And there he was, a lone rider, sitting motionless on a dark horse, watching him. The man was too far away to make out his features, but Silas didn't need to. He knew the posture, the patience, the absolute stillness of a hunter who has cornered his prey. This wasn't the law. This was a ghost from his past. And he knew, with a sudden, sickening lurch in his gut, that he hadn't just been found by accident. He had been tracked. The rider on the ridge didn't move for a long time. He just sat there, a black cutout against the morning sky, letting Silas sweat. It was a power play, a reminder that he had been in control of this encounter all along. Silas slowly, deliberately, put down his mallet. He moved to stand between the rider and the cradle where Wren was sleeping, a silent, instinctive act of shielding. Finally, the rider urged his horse forward, picking his way down the rocky slope with an unnerving confidence. As he drew closer, Silas's worst fears took shape. The man was lean and wiry, with a face that looked like it had been carved from sun-dried leather. His eyes were pale and cold, and they were fixed on Silas with an intensity that promised violence. The man reined in his horse just outside the camp. He didn't dismount. He just stared, letting the silence stretch. "It's been a long time, Silas," the man said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a deadly edge. Silas flinched. No one had called him Silas in 5 years. He had buried that name, along with the man who wore it. To the world, he was just an old prospector named Jed. "You've got the wrong man," Silas rasped, his own voice sounding foreign to him. The writer smiled, a grim, humorless slash across his face. "No," he said softly. "I don't think so. I'd know you anywhere, Silas Croft, and you owe me a debt." The name hung in the air between them, a ghost of old sins. This man, Jedediah, was not just a part of his past. He was the brother of the woman in the wagon, Sarah Miller. Jedediah was Wren's uncle, and he had come looking for answers. "What do you want?" Silas asked, his hand inching toward the handle of his axe. "Justice," Jedediah said, his eyes finally shifting from Silas to the cradle. He saw the sleeping baby. His face, already a mask of cold fury, seemed to shatter. For a moment, a raw, naked grief was exposed. "I followed the smoke. I found what was left of my sister's wagon." His voice cracked, but he mastered it instantly. He swung his gaze back to Silas. "And then I found your tracks, leading right away from it. Tell me, Silas. Tell me why I shouldn't kill you where you stand." "I didn't do it," Silas said, his voice low and urgent. "I found it just like you did." "Liar!" Jedediah's voice was a whip crack. He swung down from his horse, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol at his hip. "You were always a liar, Silas, and a coward. You ran then, and you're running now." He took a step closer, his eyes blazing. "My sister, Sarah, she trusted you. She told you where they were headed. You were the only one who knew." He was right. Sarah had sent him a letter. She didn't know the full story of his past, only that he and her brother had been friends once. She told him their route, hoping he might meet them, that he and Jedediah might reconcile. Instead, her trust had led her into a trap. "It wasn't for them," Silas said, his throat tight. "The trap was for me." Jedediah just stared at him, his face a knot of disbelief and rage. Then his eyes caught sight of the bundle of dismantled cradle pieces, and beside them, resting on a rock, the small carved wren. He lunged for it, snatching it up. He stared at it, his knuckles white. This is my mark," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I carved this. I gave it to my niece the day she was born." He looked from the bird in his hand to the baby in the cradle, and a terrible understanding dawned on his face. He looked at Silas, his eyes full of a fresh, horrifying accusation. "Where did you get that child?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. The question was the spark that lit the fuse. The fragile peace of the morning exploded into a tense, dangerous standoff. Jedediah saw a murderer and a kidnapper. Silas saw a grieving man who was about to make a fatal mistake. "I found her," Silas insisted, holding his hands up slowly, showing they were empty. "By the wagon. She's all that was left." "And I'm supposed to believe that?" Jedediah spat. "After you vanished with our money? After you left us to face him alone?" He took a threatening step forward. "Give me the child, Silas. She is my blood, not yours." "No," Silas said, his voice firm. He moved to block Jedediah's path to the cradle. "You take her and you'll get her killed. You're being watched. We both are." "What are you talking about?" "The man who did this," Silas said, his eyes scanning the ridges again. "He's not finished. He left the baby alive for a reason. She's bait, just like your sister was." A flicker of doubt crossed Jedediah's face, warring with his rage. "Who?" he demanded. "Who did this?" Silas looked him dead in the eye and spoke the name that had haunted both their nightmares for 5 long years. "Corbin." The name landed like a physical blow. Jedediah recoiled, his face paling beneath his tan. Corbin, the leader of their old gang, a man of immense cruelty and cunning, with a memory as long as his reach. "Corbin's in jail," Jedediah said, but his voice lacked conviction. It was a hope, not a fact. "He got out 6 months ago," Silas said grimly. "I heard the whispers. That's why I was on the move. I was trying to get to Sarah to warn her, to tell her to change her route. I was too late." The story began to spill out of him, the words tumbling over each other in a torrent of long-suppressed truth. He told Jedediah about the payroll job that had gone wrong, about the killing of an innocent man, about his own decision to run, taking his share of the money, unable to stomach Corbin's escalating brutality. He had left Jedediah to face the fallout. It was a coward's act, and he had lived with the shame of it every single day. "Corbin doesn't forgive," Silas finished, his voice raw. "And he doesn't forget. He wants the money I took. But more than that, he wants revenge. He used your sister to flush me out of hiding. He burned that wagon to send me a message." Jedediah stared at him, his mind reeling. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture far more terrible than he had imagined. His family hadn't been the victims of a random act of violence. They had been pawns in a vengeful game. caught in the crossfire of Silas's betrayal. His hatred for Silas was a living thing, a fire in his gut. But beneath it, a cold, terrifying logic was taking hold. Silas was right. If Corbin was truly behind this, taking the baby and running would be a death sentence for them both. Corbin would hunt them down relentlessly. "So what now?" Jedediah asked, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a cold dread. "Now," Silas said, his gaze hard. "We do what we should have done 5 years ago. We finish it. We go after Corbin." An alliance. It was unthinkable. To trust the man he held responsible for his sister's death. But what choice did he have? Silas was the only one who knew how Corbin thought, how he operated. To save Ren, he needed the man he wanted to kill. "A truce," Jedediah said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Until Corbin is dealt with. Then you and I have a score to settle." "Fair enough," Silas nodded. They stood there in the quiet of the morning, two former brothers in arms, now bitter enemies, bound by a common threat and a shared responsibility for the small, sleeping life in the cradle. They packed in silence, a heavy, volatile energy crackling between them. Jedediah watched as Silas carefully wrapped the numbered pieces of the cradle and loaded them onto Clementine. It was a strange, tender act in the midst of so much brutality, and Jedediah didn't know what to make of it. They rode out together, Silas in the lead with Ren strapped to his chest, Jedediah following a few paces behind, his hand never far from his gun. They were a fragile, dangerous alliance, heading into a storm, with a baby's life held in the balance. The journey was a long, silent ordeal. Every rock and shadow seemed to hold a threat. They avoided the main trails, sticking to the high country, their eyes constantly scanning for any sign of Corbin's men. The tension between them was a third rider, thick and suffocating. Jedediah's grief was a raw, open wound, and Silas's guilt was a heavy shroud. They made for a trading post Silas knew of, a dusty, isolated hovel called Black Creek Station, run by a man who knew how to keep his mouth shut. They needed supplies and, more importantly, information. The trader, a grizzled old man named Elias, looked them over with weary eyes. He recognized Silas, nodding curtly. "Heard you were in the area," Elias grunted, wiping a mug with a dirty rag. "Sheriff from Redemption was asking after you, asking about the Millers." Silas's gut tightened. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing to tell. Hadn't seen you." Elias's eyes flicked to Jedediah, then to the sleeping baby on Silas's chest. "But I seen someone else, a few days ago. Man with cold eyes and a silver-inlaid pistol. Name of Corbin." Jedediah stiffened, his hand dropping to his own weapon. "He wasn't alone," Elias continued, his voice dropping lower. "He had some of his boys with him, and a woman." Jedediah took a step forward. "A woman? What did she look like?" "Dark hair, looked like she'd been through hell, but she had fire in her eyes. Fought him every step. He had her tied to a saddle." Elias paused, then added, "Heard him call her Sarah." Hope, fierce and painful, surged through Jedediah. Sarah was alive. His sister was alive. She hadn't died in that fire. The relief was so overwhelming it almost brought him to his knees. But it was followed by a wave of terror. She was Corbin's prisoner. Her fate could be worse than death. The news changed the equation completely. This was no longer just a mission of revenge. It was a rescue. That night, they made a cold camp miles from the trading post. The urgency was a palpable thing, a frantic energy that left no room for sleep. While Jedediah paced like a caged animal, Silas did something that made him stop and stare. By the low light of a carefully shielded fire, Silas unwrapped the pieces of the cradle. He began to assemble it, fitting the numbered parts together with a quiet focus. "What are you doing?" Jedediah demanded, his voice strained. "We don't have time for this." Silas didn't look up from his work. "We need to rest. She needs a proper place to sleep." "A bedroll is fine. We need a plan to get Sarah back." Silas finally paused, looking at Jedediah in the flickering firelight. His face was a landscape of regret. "When I ran from Corbin," he began, his voice low and heavy, "I didn't just leave you behind. I left someone else. A wife and a daughter. She'd be about Ren's age now." Jedediah froze, the revelation stunning him into silence. "I never saw them again," Silas continued, his voice thick with a pain he had carried alone for years. Corbin made sure of that. When I found Wren, all I could see was the little girl I abandoned. I don't know how to pray, Jedediah. So I built this. It was the only thing I could think to do. A way of asking forgiveness from a ghost. He slotted the last piece into place. The cradle stood complete in the firelight, a symbol of a father's failure and a stranger's penance. For the first time, Jedediah saw past the traitor and the coward. He saw a man as broken as he was. The hatred in his heart didn't vanish, but something else took root beside it. A grim, reluctant understanding. They had both lost their families to the same man. Corbin has a place, Silas said, his voice regaining its hard edge. An old, abandoned silver mine. They call it the Widow's Maw. It's a fortress, a maze of tunnels and shafts. That's where he'll have her. A plan began to form, born from their shared history and desperation. They couldn't go in head-on. They had to be smarter. They had to use Corbin's own greed against him. Silas still had a portion of the payroll money buried near his old camp. It was their only real asset. We use the money as bait, Silas said, his eyes glinting with a dangerous light. We send a message through Elias, a false trail, lure Corbin and his main force out into the open. While they're chasing ghosts, we go into the mine for Sarah. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. If Corbin didn't take the bait, or if he left too many men behind, they would be walking into a death trap. They rode back to the trading post under the cover of darkness. Silas gave Elias the message and a gold coin for his trouble. The old trader just nodded, his face giving nothing away. The trap was set. They made their way toward the Widow's Maw, a jagged scar in the side of a desolate mountain. They found a hidden spot in the rocks overlooking the main trail to the mine, a perfect vantage point to watch and wait. For 2 days they lay there, the silence stretching their nerves to the breaking point. Jedediah held Wren, rocking her gently, his fear for his sister a constant, gnawing ache. Silas watched the trail, his face impassive, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his rifle. On the morning of the third day, they saw dust on the horizon, a group of riders. Silas raised his spyglass. "It's him," he whispered. "Corbin. He's got 4 men with him." Jedediah's heart hammered against his ribs. "Is that all of them?" "No," Silas said grimly. "He's leaving a rear guard, but he took the bait. He thinks the money is in the opposite direction. This is our chance." But as the riders drew closer, Silas let out a low curse. "He didn't take all his men. 2 of them are splitting off. They're circling around, coming up the back trail. It wasn't a full trap, but it was a complication, a deadly one. They were about to be caught in a pincer. "We have to go now," Jedediah urged, "before they get into position." But it was too late. A rifle shot cracked from the ridge behind them, the bullet whining past Silas's head and smacking into the rock. They were pinned down. Corbin's men had seen them. The trap had been turned. Gunfire erupted from both directions. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around them, sending chips of stone flying. Silas and Jedediah returned fire, their shots echoing across the canyon. They were experienced fighters, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. "We can't stay here," Silas yelled over the din. "They've got us boxed in." Jedediah looked at Wren, who had started to wail, her cries lost in the roar of the guns. Panic seized him. They were going to die here. His sister would remain a captive, and his niece would die in his arms. Silas saw the look on his face. "Give her to me," he ordered. He unslung the cradle parts from his mule. Working with frantic speed, he assembled the cradle in the small protected space behind the largest boulder. It seemed like madness to build a cradle in the middle of a gunfight. "What are you doing?" Jedediah screamed. "Creating a diversion," Silas yelled back. He placed Wren in the cradle, then pulled a long length of rope from his pack. He tied one end to the cradle and looped the other around a rock outcropping above them. "Keep them busy!" Jedediah laid down a blistering cover fire, forcing Corbin's men to duck their heads. Under the cover of the shots, Silas scrambled up the rock face, the rope in his hand. He reached the outcropping just as Jedediah's rifle clicked empty. The shooting from the other side intensified. "Silas, whatever you're doing, do it now." From his perch, Silas could see the two men on the back trail advancing on their position. He could also see a precariously balanced pile of loose rocks and scree just above them. An idea, born of pure desperation, flashed in his mind. He yanked on the rope. Down below, the cradle began to rock. The movement was visible from the trail. It was a strange, inexplicable sight. A rocking cradle in the middle of a firefight. One of the men below paused, pointing. "What in the hell is that?" That moment of hesitation was all Silas needed. He pulled a stick of dynamite from his vest, his last remnant from his prospecting days, lit the fuse and tossed it not at the men, but at the unstable rock pile above them. The explosion was deafening. The entire rock face seemed to shudder and then give way. A river of rock and debris cascaded down the mountainside, a man-made avalanche. The two men on the trail looked up with wide eyes, a heartbeat of terror before they were swept away, their cries swallowed by the roar of the slide. The sudden silence was as shocking as the explosion. Down on the main trail, Corbin and his remaining men had stopped, staring up at the massive dust cloud. They had no idea what had just happened, but their pincer was broken. Silas scrambled back down to Jedediah. "It won't hold them for long," he panted. "Let's go." They grabbed Ren from the cradle, leaving it rocking gently in the aftermath, a bizarre, silent sentinel. They used the dust and confusion as cover, slipping away from their position and scrambling towards the mine entrance. They had won a brief reprieve, but they had also announced their presence in the most dramatic way possible. Corbin now knew exactly where they were. The hunt was over. The final confrontation was about to begin inside the suffocating darkness of the Widow's Maw. The entrance to the Widow's Maw was a gaping black hole in the mountainside, exhaling a draft of cold, damp air that smelled of wet rock and forgotten things. They paused for a moment, hearts pounding, listening to the shouts of Corbin's men echoing from the canyon below. They didn't have much time. "There's another way in," Silas said, his voice a low whisper. "An old ventilation shaft. Corbin won't have it guarded. He thinks no one else knows about it." He led Jedediah along the base of the cliff to a thicket of overgrown manzanita. He pushed the branches aside, revealing a narrow, dark opening, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. "This will take us deep inside behind his main camp." The shaft was a tight, claustrophobic passage that descended steeply into the earth. They lit a small lantern, its feeble light pushing back a darkness that felt absolute. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the silence was broken only by their own ragged breaths and the soft sounds from Ren, who was now awake and watching everything with wide, curious eyes. The journey was a tense, nerve-wracking crawl. Finally, the tunnel opened into a larger cavern. They could see the flicker of a much larger fire ahead, its light dancing off the damp rock walls. Voices echoed from the main chamber. Corbin's men. They crept forward, moving from shadow to shadow, their boots making no sound on the sandy floor. They peered around a massive stone pillar. There, in the center of a large cavern, was Corbin's camp. Two men were cleaning their rifles by a roaring fire, and tied to a support timber on the far side of the cavern was a woman. Sarah. Jedediah's breath caught in his throat. She was alive. Her face was bruised and streaked with dirt, but her eyes burned with a defiant fire. He started to move forward, but Silas grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Wait," Silas breathed. "Where's Corbin?" As if summoned, a figure emerged from a side tunnel. He was a big man, with a cruel, handsome face and eyes that seemed to absorb the light around them. Corbin. He walked over to Sarah, a tin plate of food in his hand. "You should eat, Sarah," he said, his voice deceptively gentle. "Your brother and his treacherous friend are coming for you. You'll want your strength." Sarah spat at his feet. "Go to hell, Corbin." Corbin laughed, a cold, empty sound. "I've been there. It's why I'm not afraid of it." He looked around the cavern. They put on quite a show out there. A rock slide, very dramatic. Silas was always one for theatrics. He turned to one of his men. "They'll come through the main entrance. I want you and Jake to set a trap. Make it hurt." The two men grabbed their rifles and headed down the main tunnel, disappearing into the darkness. This was their chance. It was just Corbin left, but he was more dangerous than all his men combined. And then, the worst possible thing happened. Wren, startled by a sudden loud noise as Corbin tossed the tin plate against the wall, let out a small cry. It was faint, but in the echoing cavern, it sounded like a scream. Corbin froze. His head snapped in their direction. His hand went to the silver-inlaid pistol at his hip. "Well, well," he said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "It seems our guests have already arrived, and they brought a little one." There was no more hiding. Silas and Jedediah stepped out from behind the pillar, their guns raised. "It's over, Corbin," Jedediah said, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. "Let my sister go." Corbin's eyes danced with amusement. He stood directly in front of Sarah, using her as a shield. "Over? My boy, it's just getting started." His gaze shifted to Silas. "You, look at you, playing nursemaid. You always were soft, Silas. It's why you ran. You didn't have the stomach for the work." "The work was robbery, Corbin," Silas said, his voice steady. "Not murder." "Semantics," Corbin sneered. "You took my money. You turned my best man, Jedediah here, against me. And now you come into my home to try and take the one thing I have left to bargain with." He drew his pistol, its polished silver glinting in the firelight. The barrel rested against Sarah's temple. "So here's the choice: the money, your loyalty, or the girl." The standoff was a taut wire, ready to snap. Jedediah was a storm of emotion, his focus entirely on his sister. But Silas was cold. He was watching Corbin's eyes, watching his hands, seeing the old patterns. Corbin wasn't a negotiator. He was a sadist. He would kill Sarah regardless. He was just enjoying the moment. "He's going to kill her anyway, Jed," Silas said quietly, never taking his eyes off Corbin. "You know that." "Shut up," Jedediah hissed, his gun wavering. "He's right, you know," Corbin chuckled. "But the question is, who dies first?" In that split second, Silas made a decision. He had run once before, and it had cost these people everything. He wouldn't run again. He glanced at Jedediah. "Get Sarah," he said. And then he did something no one expected. He threw his own pistol into the fire. It landed with a clatter, the wood grips beginning to smoke. Corbin stared, momentarily confused. "What is this?" "This is between you and me, Corbin," Silas said, taking a step forward. "It always was." It was the opening Jedediah needed. While Corbin's attention was on Silas, Jedediah lunged, not at Corbin, but at his sister, tackling her and pulling her to the ground, out of the line of fire. Corbin snarled and turned his gun on them, but Silas was already moving. He charged, a low roar in his throat, and slammed into Corbin like a freight train. The two men crashed to the ground, the pistol flying from Corbin's hand and skittering into the shadows. It devolved into a brutal, primitive brawl. Fists, feet, teeth. Jedediah, meanwhile, was frantically cutting Sarah's ropes with his knife. As she got free, the two other henchmen, hearing the commotion, came running back up the tunnel. Sarah, freed, didn't run. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the campfire and swung it with all her might into the face of the first man, who crumpled to the ground. Jedediah engaged the second, the two of them wrestling for control of his rifle. Across the cavern, Silas and Corbin were locked in a death struggle. Corbin was bigger and stronger, but Silas was fueled by years of guilt and a burning need for redemption. He managed to get his hands on a heavy mining pick. He swung it, not at Corbin, but at the main support timber Corbin had tied Sarah to. The heavy wood splintered with a sickening crack. The timbers above them groaned in protest. Dust and small pebbles began to rain down from the ceiling. "Silas, no!" Jedediah yelled, finally dispatching the second gunman. "You'll bring the whole mine down." "That's the plan," Silas grunted, swinging again. The main beam cracked clean through. A deep rumbling sound echoed from the bowels of the mountain. The ground began to shake. Large rocks started to fall from the ceiling. The mine was collapsing. Corbin looked up in terror, his fight forgotten. "You're insane," he screamed. "Get them out of here." Silas yelled to Jedediah, pointing towards the ventilation shaft. Jedediah didn't hesitate. He grabbed Wren, who was still surprisingly calm, and pulled Sarah towards the narrow opening. "Silas, come on." But Silas just shook his head. He stood his ground, the pickaxe in his hand, blocking Corbin's path to the exit. "A debt has to be paid, Jedediah," he said, his eyes meeting his old friend's one last time. A massive section of the ceiling gave way, a shower of rock and earth sealing the main tunnel completely. Corbin, trapped, turned on Silas with a final desperate snarl. Jedediah watched for a horrified second as the two men were silhouetted against the collapsing cavern, a final, epic struggle at the end of the world. Then Sarah pulled him into the darkness of the shaft. "He made his choice, Jed. We have to go." They scrambled up the narrow tunnel, the roar of the collapsing mine chasing them, the very mountain seeming to scream as it tore itself apart. They burst out into the clean, open air, gasping for breath, just as the last of the widow's maw imploded, sending a massive plume of dust into the sky. The mine was sealed. Silas and Corbin were gone, buried under 100 tons of rock. Jedediah stood there, Ren in one arm, his other around his sister, and stared at the mountain. Justice had been served. A debt had been paid. He looked down at his niece, safe in his arms, and then he looked at the place where the mine entrance used to be, and for the first time in 5 years, he spoke Silas Croft's name not as a curse, but as a quiet, somber thank you. They returned to the spot where the gunfight had happened. The first thing they saw was the cradle, sitting untouched amidst the chaos, rocking ever so slightly in the breeze, a silent testament to the man who had built it. Jedediah walked over to it and gently placed Ren inside. She looked up at him and smiled. He looked at Sarah, his heart full of a sorrow and a relief so profound he had no words for it. They had survived. They were a family again, a broken one, but a family nonetheless. They gathered their things, loaded the cradle onto Clementine, and rode away not looking back. They were heading west towards a new life, leaving the ghosts of the widow's maw behind them. Days later, miles away, a figure staggered out of a different, long-forgotten prospecting tunnel on the far side of the mountain. He was caked in dirt, his clothes were shredded, and his body was a tapestry of bruises and cuts. But he was alive. It was Silas. He had found a way out, an old crawl space he remembered from years ago. Corbin had not been so lucky. Silas stood on the ridge, leaning heavily on the pickaxe he still carried, and watched the horizon. He could just make out three figures in the distance, a man, a woman, and a mule, riding towards the setting sun. He watched them until they were just a speck. He didn't follow. His part in their story was over. His penance was paid. He had delivered them from the evil he had brought into their lives. He was no one's husband, no one's father, no one's friend. But as he stood there watching the family he had saved disappear, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. He turned his back on the west and began walking north. A man with no name and no past, finally free. Years passed. The dust settled. In a small, quiet town in the Northern Territories, a carpenter became known for his skill and his quiet demeanor. He had a small shop on the edge of town, filled with the clean scent of sawdust and wood varnish. He was a master of his craft, but he was especially known for the beautiful, sturdy cradles he built. One day, a young couple came into his shop, their newborn baby bundled in a bright blue blanket. They wanted to commission a cradle, something special, something that would last for generations. The carpenter, an older man with kind eyes and calloused hands, smiled. He looked at the baby, and for a moment his smile was tinged with a distant, gentle sadness. But it was not a sad smile. It was the smile of a man who understood the value of safe harbors, of new beginnings, of debts paid in full. He looked at the happy young family, and in their eyes he saw a future he had helped make possible, and he was content. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe.